Mr. President, members of the Senate, the people of Alaska, this is a bill that is a people's bill. Mr. President, for all the time that I've served in Alaska's legislature, people have contacted me about eliminating daylight saving time. They've expressed frustration in government intrusion into their lives, disruption in test scores, a general frustration with changing clocks and the waste of that time, increased work injuries, negative health contexts, negative safety proposals from across the state. Mr. President, it's a people's bill for more than one reason. In the 21st legislature, then Representative Corrin introduced a bill to repeal this. In the 22nd legislature, Representative Lancaster introduced a bill to repeal. In the 24th legislature, Senator Olson introduced a bill to repeal. In the 24th legislature, Representative Salmon introduced a bill to repeal. And in the 26th legislature, Representative Fairclough introduced a bill. Mr. President, Representative Fairclough stands in the Senate today as Senator MacKinnon asking the same question. Should the people of Alaska and the policymakers of Alaska repeal daylight savings time? It's frustration to some, Mr. President, but it's a real health issue to others. For those people who think this is just the effort of 5 minutes of switching your clocks every day, there are people in Alaska and around the world that changing time, that jet lag feeling that some feel, are true health consequences. We have studies now that are emerging across the world showing that there is an increased rate for men for heart attacks directly after going on to daylight saving time and off the switching. Mr. President, we have suicide rates that are now being suggested as related to a cause on the switching. We have people with different health issues in mental capacities that are differently affected by the switching back and forth. Mr. President, Benjamin Franklin is given the credit, or not, of originally trying to save wax and wicks in an effort to save energy during time of war. They tried it out. In 1918, the United States decided to try it out during World War I, again, with the premises to conserve energy. Mr. President, I would assert today that we live in very different times. We're not saving energy. In fact, we have studies that show that energy increases with daylight saving time. We have studies that can tell us anything and everything, but what I'd like the senators on this floor to remember today, that real people are being affected by this, and most Alaskans support the repeal. 78% of Alaskans self-selected in a survey that I requested. When I carried this bill in 2009, 500 plus people from around Alaska contacted me. It's very unusual for a legislator on one piece of legislation to generate 3,700 individual responses. 78% of Alaskans in every community across the state support this repeal. Southeast Alaska is certainly expressing some opposition. So if your offices have received opposition, I certainly want to acknowledge that there are reasons that it will be a disadvantage to some businesses. In Southeast, though, as we looked at a regional crosstab, Southeast still supported the elimination of daylight saving time with over 500 responses at a rate of 53.7%. In other areas, like the far north, where they are 3 hours off of their time, sun time, so if we think noon and the sun is straight up, our coastal communities in Northwest Alaska are 3 hours off of their biological time. 74% of the far north support elimination of daylight saving time. In fact, Mr. President, 85.9% of interior Alaska supports the reduction. Again, I want to say this is a self-selecting poll, but I want my colleagues to know who I reached out to try to get input from. I reached out to people with the assistance of my staff, to chambers, to businesses that I thought should be involved in the conversation. We reached out to school districts where schools might be affected, airlines because they would have to adjust schedules. I even spoke with the cruise industry because I knew that Southeast Alaska is very dependent on tourism. Mr. President, I tried to reach out to those that would be negatively impacted, and still 70, I want to get the number right, 78% still supported the elimination. An Indiana study showed that there were, I believe it was $7 million or $9 million increase of energy consumption when they did a study on and off daylight saving time. Mr. President, Indiana showed it, California studied it, Arizona doesn't go on it, neither does Hawaii, so all of the obstacles can be overcome. Specific to Alaska, last time I carried this particular issue, rural Alaskan teachers contacted me about testing. We do most of our testing, or at least we did, when we go on to daylight saving time right now. Some people would attribute the disruption in classroom or the excitement of students to spring fever. That's what we call it. We've seen a lot of darkness for a long time, and spring fever has been given the label. But what if it truly is something that's happening to children's bodies where brains aren't fully developed? Now we have a study that shows actually a drop in SAT scores, specifically with a causation relationship between the switching of daylight saving time. Mr. President, I could go on. There's others that may want to talk about a negative or positive effect of daylight saving time, but truly I appreciate the floor time today to talk about it. I respect those who don't support it. I encourage all those to support it. Mr. President, I've written down at least the issues that I have a little bit of counterpoints for Alaskans to consider. I'll take on the commerce issue first. I know that change is hard. We fight change every day, and the members here face change every day as we bring different policy discussions before the people of Alaska and to different chambers in this legislature. But I passed out something called Daylight Gains by City, and I just want to point to that because I want you to know on the commerce issue, whether you're flying a plane or meeting a cruise ship or whatever you're doing, we gain in Juneau, Alaska, 1 hour of daylight in 11 days. 11 days is the effect of 1 hour of light. Now, we gain time different ways during a day as far as morning light and evening light. So to gain all of the morning light, it takes 21 days. So the range of what we're talking about on tourism and the impact specific, I believe, to Southeast Alaska is on the shoulder season between 11 and 21 days. So I just want to narrow our conversation in looking at that. I certainly would never propose to pit one portion of the state against the other, and do recognize and acknowledge that Southeast Alaska gave up an hour during the consolidation of time zones in 1982. I believe Anchorage gave up that hour also. But we weren't on Seattle time, so I understand the difference. Mr. President, federal law controls time zones, not state law. The only decision that this legislative body can take up is whether we're on daylight saving time or off, and then our governor needs to tell the Department of Transportation federally what we've decided. And so far we've decided to continue to be on. I suggest we should be off. But in recognition of the people of Alaska, not just in Southeast, but across our state, that want to go into the time zone discussion, we put an amendment in Senate Finance that allowed that discussion to happen, not over and over again, because you have to, as a legislative body or through administrative order, have to ask the federal government to bring up that issue. And specific to the recognition on commerce, the only issue, or at least one of the larger weighted criteria for discussion of time zone, is the commerce issue. So should you vote yes? Should our governor sign the bill? Should the other body vote yes? We would ask the federal government to come into Alaska and talk to different communities across the different regions. But the only thing we can decide as Alaskans is yes or no on switching back and forth. Mr. President, we've talked about finances, and so I've heard from the permanent fund before, or the investment industry as a whole. And I checked. We're heavily invested in real estate, if you didn't know, and so that really isn't affected by the markets going back and forth, whether we contact that every day or not. And then I looked at the foreign equity holdings. We must, if we have foreign equities, we must be dealing with different markets, right, across the world. And so I absolutely acknowledge that it is a policy decision or a managerial decision on how we want to communicate with the East Coast and the New York Stock Exchange, but it is not the only stock exchange that we discuss with. Mr. President, I always smile when I think about Dan Cuddy, President, Alaska, National Bank of Alaska. He's followed this issue for some 6 years now with me. And the first letter of support that I received in introducing this bill again was from Dan Cuddy in the financial industry, who believes this is a silly thing to do. Mr. President, members of the Senate, people of Alaska, it's time to stop changing back and forth. Please support Senate Bill 6.
Okay, thank you, Senator MacKinnon.